Okay, I will see who. There we go here. Okay, come on here. There we go. All right, fantastic. Okay, well, hey, welcome back. By the way, I was out for 2 weeks, so I guess I should tell myself welcome back because it was my vacation, not yours. Oh, good. I appreciate that.
Yeah, Randy.
So yeah, welcome. So we are in part 4, which is called the authority of the king. So let me just kind of give you go back in the Wayback Machine here just for a moment. A couple of weeks ago, we ended with the Messiah's authority over demons. Now remember, part 4 is the authority of the king. He's been presented as the king, and now in this section, he's proving that he has the authority to be the king, to be the promised Messiah, right? So everything that's going to happen in this section here is related to him demonstrating his authority over things, whether it's nature, whether it's demons, whether it's the teachings of the Pharisees, defilement. All of these things are part of demonstrating his authority. And last time that we met, we looked at his authority over demons. So if you remember correctly, after the incident in Nazareth, he comes down and he establishes his hometown, or is it not his hometown, his headquarters for his ministry in the town of what? What's the town? Capernaum. Okay. Capernaum. And 6 other ways of saying it. Okay, yes, Carfunum is actually what it is in Hebrew, so Carfunum, but we'll do Capernaum. Anyway, so he establishes that town as his main headquarters, right? And last time that we met, he was in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And remember, it said that he was teaching, and he was teaching as one with authority, not like it said the scribes. You remember that, right? And the crowd was amazed because he didn't quote another rabbi. Remember, you would always have to quote your teacher. So Rabbi so-and-so said X, right? The authority wasn't your own. It was based off of who you were taught by or your rabbinic school. Jesus comes in and just says, this is how it is, as if he's the one that's written the scriptures and is the one that can actually authoritatively interpret them, right? They're absolutely amazed at what is going on. And in the middle of his teaching, in the middle of the amazement of the people, there's a demoniac that comes up. And the demon exclaims who he is, like he's the Messiah, right? And Christ, of course, with a word, just tells him to be silent, get out. And he throws the guy to the floor and the demon leaves. And the crowd's amazed because he's able to exorcise this demon without any of these, these convoluted different types of procedures or incantations, any kind of mechanical devices that would have been used by the Pharisees, who could also exorcise demons, with a word, leave, go. And they do it. And the crowd is like, how does he do this? He has authority over demons as well. So that's the event that leads us directly into what we're going to talk about tonight, right? So these events are connected. I just want to make sure that we painted that picture for you. No. That's several times ago. Where we left off last time was he had fled Nazareth, come down, established Capernaum as his hometown. Yeah. And he was then teaching on the Sabbath in the synagogue. And it was when he was teaching in the synagogue that there was a demon-possessed man, and he commanded the demon to go. And the people were amazed at his authority, number one, to teach, and his authority over demons. Correct? Yeah, that was up in Nazareth. Okay, or sorry, that was up and to the left, south, in Nazareth, and then he goes to Capernaum, which is on the Sea of Galilee. So his casting out of the demon in the synagogue is going to lead to this event that happens on the same day. All right. So
this is really a great book to follow. If you have an opportunity to really teach on Amazon.com.
Great book.
And it almost follows his teaching, and it's a great review to go back through, and it's see where we have been. Thanks for the suggestion, I'll do that.
Yeah, and it's in, by the way, the book that he's talking about is in my weekly email that I send out. So if you do want to get a little, yeah, go ahead and read it. But yeah. So Mike, I got plenty to cover, so let's rip on. Thank you for the PSA. So this is what has happened. He has just cast the demon out of the man in the synagogue, and then the next event happens. So just kind of keep that in mind, because this is the build upon. Now, we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, who cover this next event. And I'm going to go ahead and read from Luke, and then I'm going to point out the differences in Mark and Matthew, which I've highlighted in yellow. So it says, and he arose and left the synagogue. So he has just cast out the demon. He gets up, because remember, he's teaching, and a rabbi always teaches from the sitting position. So he was sitting when the demoniac started to say, you're the Christ, or whatever else, and from a sitting position, he cast him out. He gets up and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever, and they appealed to him on her behalf. And he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her, and immediately she rose and began to serve them. Now, when the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. And demons also came out of many, crying, you are the Son of God. But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak, because they knew that he was the Christ. Okay, that's Luke's version. Now, Mark says, and he immediately left the synagogue, right? So as soon as the demoniac is cast, the demon is cast out of the demoniac, he immediately leaves. He doesn't do anything else. He doesn't do any more teaching. And then Matthew adds that they brought to him all who were oppressed by demons, casting out the spirits, and he healed all who were sick. And then Matthew ties in this healing of all the townspeople that come to him as a fulfillment of Isaiah the prophet, where he says in Isaiah 53, he took our illnesses and bore our diseases. Okay, so that's the account, and you can see the slight differences or additions from each one of the synoptic gospels. All right. Now, what we see here is that both Mark and Luke tell us that this next event, this healing of Peter's mother-in-law, happens immediately after the casting out of the demon in the synagogue, right? So that's really important to understand that what is going to happen is the same day that happens, right? So one event happens right after another, okay? Now, it says that his mother-in-law had a high fever. Now, Luke says high fever. The other ones just say fever. But in the Greek here, this is a fever that is intense, is life-threatening, and it has been going on for a while, right? So it's not just like, oh, I'm kind of feeling a little bit sick, I need to lie down. Like, she is bedridden. The fever is critical, and she's had it for a while. So she is really in jeopardy of life, is the way that the Greek would look at this high fever, right? Now, when you read the three accounts, you'll notice that they all three say something just a little bit different. They're not contradictory, but you can see that each writer picks out a different element of what Christ does. So, for instance, it says Matthew says that he touched her hand, grabbed her hand, and healed. Luke says that Mark says that he raised her up, okay, right? And then, of course, Luke just says that he spoke and rebuked the fever, and the fever left. Now, that's not a contradiction. It just means that each one of them, because of their theme, is recording a certain element, right? So you've got, for instance, Mark. The act of actually raising somebody up is the act of a servant. And of course, Mark's focus is Jesus, the Messiah, the servant of Jehovah. So he looks at the fact that Jesus has raised up the mother-in-law. So when you put all three gospel accounts together, what you have is what we have here with Luke, which is Jesus, and we don't know if he rebuked first and then grabbed her hand and lifted her up, or grabbed her hand and lifted her up and then rebuked. It's hard to say. But likely it was Jesus rebuked the fever, grabbed her by the hand, and lifted her out of bed. Okay, so you put all three together, there's no contradiction. There's just, they are recording that event from different perspectives. Now, what's interesting again is that in both cases, the demoniac and also the mother-in-law, that once the healing occurs, both individuals are left without any kind of impact of that, right? It said, remember, the demoniac, when the demon came out of him, it threw him down the floor. It convulsed him and threw him down the floor, but then it was very careful to say that the person was unharmed. So when Christ heals, the demon tried to hurt the gentleman, but the healing of Christ said, look, I'm going to heal him completely. There's not going to be an after effect. The same thing with Peter's mother-in-law, that she immediately could serve. Now, if you know that you've been sick and your fever breaks, you do not immediately get up and do anything. I mean, it takes you a while, but immediately fever's gone and she's up and able to serve everyone that is there, right? Within that household. So we've got this immediate impact of the healing of Christ, right? And so that's really the second miracle that commentators have looked at here, is that the first miracle is the healing of her, the fever being removed, but the second one is the immediate infusion of strength that comes from Christ, right? So all this happens here, and then Peter's mother-in-law is healed. Now they're in the house. It's on the Sabbath. So they're not going to do anything. So Jesus and Peter and Andrew, we're going to find out, Andrew lives there as well, and Peter's wife and his mother-in-law and maybe others, we don't know, are now inside of the house. And it's a Sabbath. So on the Sabbath, they're going to rest. So for the remainder of that Sabbath day, nothing happens except for the fellowship within the house. At least that's what we can tell from the text. But when the Sabbath ends, we get a huge reaction from the crowd in Capernaum to the miracles of Christ. They respond positively. And so you see in Mark and Luke and Matthew, here's what it says. And in Mark it says, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. So in other words, like the idea here, now this may be hyperbole, but the idea is that basically everyone in the city has heard about the demoniac. They've already probably have heard about the healing of the nobleman's son, who, remember, was from Capernaum, that went up to Nazareth, and Christ said, your son is healed, go. Remember that one? That nobleman was from Capernaum. So you've got the nobleman's son that's been healed, you have the demoniac, and then you have the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. So with these different healings and the other miracles Christ did at the Passover, now you've got this whole town of Capernaum that is coming, and they want Christ to minister to them. So the whole city was gathered at the door, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases, cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Now remember, we talked about this last time. What is that? The demons always recognize who Christ is, and they always acknowledge he's the Son of God, he's the Christ. And he always tells them, shut up, don't speak. He mutes them so that they cannot say anything else, because he does not want to take recommendation, commendation, or acknowledgement from demons, right? Okay, so Luke then says, and every one of them he healed. So he didn't just heal some, like everyone that was brought to him he healed. And demons also came out of many, crying, what? You are the Son of God, which is a unique title for Christ, and that he was in fact the Messiah. So Luke adds that extra one of what the demons were exclaiming, which they've already said that in our last episode that we looked at.
You know what I find amazing there is
Hold on. There you go.
that the demons know him,
Mhm.
but his own people don't even know him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they deny him, and eventually.
Yeah.
The demons knew who he was.
Yeah, and the thing is that of course his own people should have recognized that. And that's where, when we get to Matthew chapter 12 and 13, where they actually do the national rejection of him, that's why their penalty is so harsh. And in fact, millions of them will die because of God's judgment upon them for rejecting him as the Messiah, even though he's demonstrated who he was. And that's Matthew chapter 12 and 13, right? So, and the judgment upon them is death, which they will suffer.
Even to this day, still, it's the Jewish people, and they go out of their way to do away with them as best we earthly possibly can.
Yeah, and if we were to look at that from an eschatological perspective, we would realize that that's Satan's doing and why he still wants to eliminate the Jewish people. Because if he can do that, then God can't fulfill his plans, right? So there's still an ongoing desire of Satan to eliminate the Jewish people. But that's an eschatological question. Well, it's not next week, but that's eschatology. All right, so the thing here is that all three gospels tell us that, indicate that this is the same day. So immediately he leaves, this happens, and then at night they gather, right? Now, you might ask, well, why did they wait so long? Why didn't they just come, like after he cast out the demon? Why didn't they just come to the house, right? Well, the reason for that is because of the Pharisaic teaching that you couldn't walk. Yeah, I mean, they prohibited any kind of work, including healing, by the way, unless it was life-threatening, you weren't allowed to heal. So what Christ was doing here on the Sabbath, by the way, went against that. But the people aren't willing to break Pharisaic law. You break Pharisaic law, you can be, expelled from the synagogue. So even though Christ has done all of this, they're going to wait until the Sabbath ends, and then they're going to come. Now, we reckon days based off of midnight, right? It comes to midnight and is the next day. Well, of course, the Jews don't do that. They reckon the day starts at sundown and it ends at sundown, right? So the Sabbath starts Friday evening when it's dark and you have 3 stars that are visible, right? That would then start the Sabbath, right? We still think it's Friday, but they call it the Sabbath, and it ends on Saturday evening when it gets dark and 3 stars are visible. So that's how they count their days. So what you have here is on the Sabbath, Saturday, probably in the morning, it's daytime. He goes into the synagogue. He casts out the demon from the demoniac. They go back to Peter's house. He heals Peter's mother. But then the people wait until it's dark to come to him, because that means that it's no longer the Sabbath, it's the first day of the week. So they're actually coming to him on Sunday, even though we would think of it as Saturday. Does that all make sense? That's why they're waiting until the Sabbath ends in order to bring the people to be healed, because they can't bring someone to be healed because it's not lawful to heal on the Sabbath, according to the Pharisees, right? So the people are still they're still cautious around the Pharisees. All right. What we see here then is that this massive group of people from this town, which was not a tiny town, by the way, this massive people comes to the house of Simon. And basically, there are 2 groups that are listed out here. Now, this is kind of important because you've got 2 groups. Number 1, those who are demonized. Number 2, those who are physically ill. And it's important to point this out because there are certain groups within Christianity that will teach that all sickness is the result of demonic activity, right? And so they'll be casting out the demon of pneumonia and the demon of hangnails, and I mean, whatever it is. If there's some physical ailment, there's a demon behind it, and all kinds of demonic activity going on. And in fact, what we learn, not only from this scripture, but from other scriptures, that sometimes people are sick just because that is what happens to people because of the fall, right? Of no issue of their own, has nothing to do with sin or demonic activity. Sometimes sickness is the result of sin, and sometimes it's the result of demonic activity. But we clearly have 2 groups of people, those who were sick, physically ill, and those who were demonized, correct? So that tells us that idea that all sickness is the result of demons is not correct, right? Now, Luke then reemphasizes this again, which we had in our last session, that they understand exactly who he is. You are the Son of God. Now, remember, we talked about this, gosh, I don't know, a while ago. We think of the Son of God as just a title, like I'm a son of God and you're a son of God. We're all sons and daughters of God, right? This idea. And we kind of think of it just as a way of saying that someone's a believer or someone is, just a human being type of thing. But the Jews didn't view it that way, right? Israel was called the Son of God, but that is a collective. They never would have claimed as an individual to be the Son of God, right? As a collective group of Israel or Jews, they would have said Israel is the son of God, but Randall Casper is not a son of God, right? But the demons recognize that Christ is the Son of God. You are the Son of God, not a son of God, but the Son of God. And that's the unique relationship that they recognize. And of course, they say that because they know he is the Christ. And again, that's the second time in two episodes that we've seen that, in fact, the demons say the exact same thing about who Christ is. Okay, then Matthew pulls in this quote from Isaiah. And in Isaiah 53, we have it where he says that he took our illnesses and bore our diseases, right? And so Matthew says, hey, look, what is starting to happen here is we're starting to see that Christ is intervening in human illnesses, that our diseases and our infirmities are in some way now being rectified by the coming of the Messiah. Not fully rectified, but the process is being started. And so Matthew attributes the work of Christ, and he looks at this example of Christ healing everyone who came as the work of the Messiah that will eventually continue on throughout history. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind here is that Matthew adds these two different details here. The first one is that he just says that that Christ just, with a word, the demons are exorcised. Now, going back to what we talked about last week, or not last week, but the last episode that we were in, was that the rabbis could exorcise demons as well, but they used convoluted incantations. They, remember, had to be able to communicate with the demon, and they had to know they wanted to know the demon's name, because they had to have the demon's name in order to be able to use the incantation to cast them out. And what Matthew adds here, again, we wouldn't notice it, but they reacted to it, the people, because he just orders them out. He doesn't even try to establish communication. He just says, go. And they leave. This different level of authority, right? The other thing that Matthew says here again is this quote of Isaiah 53. Now, some groups in Christianity will take this out of context, and they'll say, oh, look at that. Christ has took on our illnesses and bore our diseases. And what that has turned into is this faith-based Christianity, which says that if you're a believer, if you just have enough faith, Christ has already taken your illnesses and bore your disease. So if you have enough faith, you'll be healed. And if you're sick as a believer, it's because you don't have enough faith. Right? Has anyone heard that or heard that type of stuff? They get that from these types of passages here that Matthew says, oh, well, Christ has already bore our illnesses and our diseases. And therefore, if you just had enough faith, then you would be healed, right? Now, we know that that's not the case, because all you have to do is continue to read the gospel accounts, and we realize that many of the times Christ heals have nothing to do with a person's lack of faith or anything else, right? Or doesn't heal, doesn't have anything to do with the person's lack of faith. Sometimes it does. The thing we have to remember is we're not promised in this life to not get sick or to die. Now think about it. Even the people that Christ healed, eventually what happens to them? They die. Even the people that Christ resurrects from the dead while he was on earth, do what? They die. Right? So our complete healing that is promised then by the blood of the Messiah will not come until we have our glorified bodies. Right? Okay, so don't get trapped in that whole thing. If you just had more faith, you'd be healed, and the fact that you aren't healed means that you're just not a very good Christian. You don't have enough faith, right? That's not what you need to be pulling out of this particular section. Now, I like what Louis Barbieri says. He says, "His taking our infirmities and carrying our diseases was finally accomplished on the cross in his death." So now remember, Christ hasn't died yet. So even the full payment that Christ makes as the Messiah for our sins and illnesses hasn't even been done yet, right? So even that part would be out of context. But in anticipation of that event, Jesus performed many definite acts of healing in his ministry. In other words, showing the type of thing that the Messiah has come to do, and that eventually will happen to everyone who is a believer. Okay, kind of want to end this section here, and then I'll stop and pause for some questions here. Oh, okay, let me just get through this here. Darrell Bock says this, and again, he's tying right now, he's tying the event that we just had with the demoniac in the synagogue with the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. He says this, in the summary tied to this miracle, Matthew mentions the exorcisms and healings in agreement with the parallels in Mark and Luke, but he adds 2 notes. First, he observes that exorcisms took place with his word, not with magical incantations or elaborate rituals often associated with such acts. And of course, those right there, Tobias and Josephus, Antiquities, those are all Jewish writings where they recorded these types of convoluted types of magical incantations by the rabbinic leaders. Second is the remark about fulfilling what Isaiah had proclaimed in 53:4, where the servant who performs God's call engages sickness and disease on behalf of the people. The effects of sin are now being reversed. All right, so it's a really incredible thing that we start to see where Jesus, from this point onward, we see that he starts to continue to heal people in anticipation of this being completely reversed for all of us in the future. All right. The other thing that's important here with this particular healing that we miss out on is that according to the rabbis, someone that has a high fever like this can only be healed by God. There wasn't a remedy available for healing this. There wasn't anything within their power that they knew. So according to the rabbinic tradition, only God can extinguish the fever. Whoever heals a person with fever operates with the power of God. So if God isn't with you, you're not going to be able to do anything. Now, remember, Nicodemus in John chapter 3 said what? What did he say? We know that you have come from God because no one can do these things unless what? God is with him, right? So early on, there was a recognition that you can't do this stuff unless God is with you. Here again, he's doing a healing activity that the rabbis recognize that unless God is with you, this cannot be done. So when he heals Peter's mother-in-law, a fever, he is performing an act that only God is able to do through an individual. So Jesus must be in alignment with God. Now keep that in mind because this is what the people should be learning. And when we get to Matthew chapter 12 and Matthew chapter 13, when they reject him, they should not have rejected him because all the evidence that leads up to that should have pointed clearly to the fact that God was with Jesus in everything that he said and did and in his identification of him as the Messiah. Okay, let me stop and pause and ask for questions or comments. You had a comment, Mike?
I have a question. My question is this. My brother was suffering from inhuman back pain. And I was constantly trying to get Christ out of his head and into his heart. And so I would send him text messages and I would say things like, you have not because you ask not. And one of them here was, as you are on your face worshiping and pleading with him to have mercy on you, ask him in faith for complete healing. And in faith, expect it. You need to trust him, brother. You must surrender all to him. You cannot do this alone. Ask the helper, the Holy Spirit, to go before you in everything that you do. Do this daily. So was I misleading him in telling him that he needed to ask Christ for a complete healing?
No, I wouldn't. No, I don't think it's wrong for you to say that he should be asking. We're told to ask. We're told to come even before the the elders to be anointed. And so there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. What we want to be careful of, though, is saying, if you had more faith, God would heal you. And the reason why you're not being healed is because you don't have enough faith. That's where we would be wrong, right? We're not promised that we're told to ask, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're told to ask in accordance with what? God's will. Well, his will may be that I'm not healed. So I can ask, and as long as my asking is in accordance with his will, guess what? I'm going to get healed. But if for some reason he has desired not to do that, I can continue to ask, and that does not mean he's going to heal. Right? So we encourage people to pray for healing, and we are encouraged to pray for people to be healed, but that does not guarantee that. And in fact, we know that must be the case, because eventually you and I have to what? Die. So there comes a point when you are going to die, and God's not going to save you. So if it was just a matter of if you had enough faith, you could live forever, because all you'd have to do is believe no matter what you were suffering from, you would always survive. We'd have like 3,000-year-old people hanging around, because every time they got a cold, they're just like, God heal me. It's there it goes, it's gone. So we know for a fact that we're not guaranteed to be healed. But that shouldn't stop us from asking for and believing that God has the power to do it. And if it's your will, you can do it, but it doesn't guarantee it, right?
It seems like it would be a great testimony. We always say that all things are done for the glory of God. And to see him to be healed would have been a great, wonderful testimony throughout our family and everybody who are associated with this particular situation.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing you said that is that we say that people don't necessarily have a lot of faith, and therefore it's not going to happen for you. Jesus himself said, you have faith of a mustard seed.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have no faith. If you have the faith of a mustard seed, you could move that mountain.
Yeah.
So, I mean, faith is a big deal. We're saved by his grace through faith.
You need to have faith, but because if you don't have faith, you don't have faith, you have to demonstrate faith, yes, but your faith does not guarantee your healing.
I'm with
you
on that.
Yeah.
It's God's will.
Yeah.
I completely get it. I understand it. But it just seems like he would have been more glorified in saving this young man as opposed to allowing him to die.
Maybe. So here's the thing. I'm going to take a quick detour off this. Number one, we don't know why God heals some and doesn't heal others. Eventually, he's not going to heal you. You're either going to die by murder, you're going to die by accident, you're going to die by disease. Those are your three options, right? No other options out there, right? So eventually it's going to happen, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is we don't know why God chooses one and not the other. The third thing is that we don't know what the calculus is for determining if he would get more glory from an event versus how it turned out. You can't say that. We might think that, but we can't say that. Let me give you an example, right? I have right now, and I won't name who this is because I haven't been given liberty to do it, but there is a person that one of my professors who has had cancer for the second time, and it's devastating, painful. The procedures are horrible. And you might ask, and he posts on this stuff all the time, and you might think, well, gosh, God would get more glory if when he went in his first visit and they said, you got cancer, all of a sudden when he goes back to his next one, he's got no cancer. Wouldn't that give God more glory? Because he could tell everybody, look, God healed me of cancer. What has happened, though, is that almost every time he has a doctor's appointment, whether it's a nurse or a doctor or the dentist, guess what he's able to do? He's telling them about Jesus Christ. He's actually getting more opportunities to glorify God and to talk about who God is and he's having people come to saving faith. So we have no way of knowing what that calculus is. It may feel to me like God would get more glory in the healing, but I don't know that. Because we don't know what in other words, it's what's called a counterfactual. The factual is what happened. We can't say that the counterfactual, which would be something's counter to fact, like if this thing had happened, then X would happen. You don't know that. That's like saying, if I hadn't married my spouse, this would have happened. You have no idea what would happen if you didn't marry your spouse. But you did marry your spouse. You have no idea what that calculus is going to be. So that's where, as believers, we have to rest in the fact that God is going to get his glory and is going to work through circumstances, and he knows what that calculus is. He knows what the counterfactuals would be. And you have to rest on that, right? Because it's too easy for us to get into the wouldn't it have been better if, in this case, God would have healed somebody. Yes, Rich, you have a comment.
Again, I agree with everything you're saying on that, but at the same time, when Fruit Bomb says that, we won't get our healing until glory happens.
Or we won't be fully. What he's.
I just find that counterintuitive to what we are saying that, in faith, we expect to be healed.
What he's saying there is he's saying that you won't get complete and total healing until you have your glorified body. Because until you have your glorified body, you're always susceptible to murder or violence, to accident or disease. Doesn't matter how many times you've been healed. God could heal you 1,000 times during your life, but you're going to die sometime by one of those. And that's his only point, is that your full, complete healing, where you have a body now that is not susceptible to death or disease or to pain or suffering, will not come until it's glorified. And that's actually what the Bible promises us. That's what it tells us we'll get. It never promises that glorified body in this life. In fact, it tells us just the opposite. You are going to die. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
So is what you just took us through more about Jesus? I had it in my head here a minute ago, but it just evaporated. Who he is versus, I mean, the miracles and the things that he did was a testimony to who he is, right?
Mm-hmm.
As God, as the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
So is this more about that and less about the actual act of what he's doing?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. And let me see if I can sort of rephrase what you just said there. Is that
when these miracles happen, as a believer of Christ, you have this expectation that he's going to do the same thing for you. But whether he does it for you or not doesn't change who he is,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so my question is more about who he is than what he does and how he does it.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that is when the Messiah is present, physically present on the earth, things do operate differently than when he's not. In fact, he even says, when the bridegroom is present, the groomsmen or the bridal party doesn't do what? They don't weep. They don't mourn. When the bridegroom's here, you rejoice. But when the bridegroom is absent, when he's not physically here, there is a difference. Now, you might say, well, why is that? Well, because when he's here, guess what he's doing? For this 3.5 years, he is doing certain things, healings and miracles to do what? It's first and foremost, those things are being done to demonstrate his authority over disease, over nature. That's the primary reason. Now, secondarily, he's doing it because he has what? Compassion on the sick. So it's not as if it's just hey, I'm only doing it for that. But his primary reason is to demonstrate who he is as the Messiah. That can only happen when he is present. So you would expect that everybody that he wants to heal gets healed, because what would it look like if you're the Messiah and I heal you, but I can't heal you, and I can't heal you, but I can heal you? I mean, it could be random, it could be whatever else. So when he's here, if people come to him, he's going to heal them. right? Because he's demonstrating who he is in his messianic character. When the Messiah is away, he's going to operate differently, because the purpose of the healing while he's away is not to what? It's not to demonstrate he's the Messiah. It's to do what? It's out of what? Compassion for the person. And based off of his will about what he wants to have accomplished because of the person either being healed or not being healed. Make sense? So when the Messiah is present, things operate differently than when the Messiah is not. That's just the way I would put it. And how to make more sense out of that in individual circumstances like your brother, those are the hard ones, because I can talk about general theoretical things like I just did, but why your brother was not healed and why someone else is, I don't know. All right, any other questions or comments? All right. So let's move on to our next section here now. So again, he's just healed Peter's mother-in-law, showing that he has authority over disease. Now he's going to again show that he has authority to preach. Okay. And this is what it says here. It says, I'm going to read here from Luke, and then I'm going to go back to Matthew. In Luke, it says, and when it was day, okay? So now he's got done healing all these people. They've come to him at night. Now it's the next morning, right? And when it was day, he departed and went into a desolate place. Okay, so he's woke up the next morning. He's probably tired, probably exhausted. I mean, you've dealt with the whole entire city coming and begging you, and you've healed everybody, right? He went to a desolate place, and the people sought him and came to him. Now, why do you think the people are coming to him? They want something. Like, we got the magic man in town. Like, look, I've also got like this mule over here that, you know, is like sick. And I've also got like, you know, there are all kinds of things that this guy I think could do for us, right? So the people sought him and came to him and would have kept him from leaving them. Like, that was their whole goal. We got to find it. Where did the magic man go? We went back to Simon's house, and guess what? Not there. Where'd he go? We got to find this guy, because this guy is the key to everything. If he just stays with us, he's got the goods. We'll never be hungry. We'll never die. I mean, that's what's going on here, right? And they would have kept him from leaving them. But he said to them, I must preach. So in other words, they found him, and they conveyed what their desire was. But he said to them, I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns as well, for I was sent for this purpose. And he was preaching in the synagogues of Judea. Now, Mark adds, and rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, right? So before anyone's really wanting to be up, he goes out. We don't know how early it was, but it was very early in the morning, probably somewhere around maybe 3, 4 o'clock, something like that. He departed and went out to the desert place, and there he prayed. So now we know that the object of him going was prayer, was for him to be alone with the Father. And it says, and Simon and those who are with him. So all of a sudden now Simon is leading the search with the townspeople. So now you get the actual picture here that even his disciples don't know what's going on. So Simon's leading. The crowds people are probably like, well, look, we'll just follow Simon because he's a disciple. He'll know where he's at, right? And search for him, right? And it says in Matthew's account, it says that he went throughout all Galilee. So in other words, after Luke says that, hey, I have to go, I'm not going to stay here. Mark says, and he said to them, let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also. And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in synagogues and casting out demons. Matthew then says that he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So now he's gone through all the other different towns in Galilee, doing the same thing he just did in Capernaum, right? Here's the resultant of that. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted by various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. So Matthew adds that it's not just in Galilee or Judea, but now we've got Syria, Decapolis, Jerusalem, and the area that is beyond the Jordan River. All right. So this is what's going on now. Okay. So just a quick recap of what we just talked about, because I think I've covered most of the stuff here. He heals mother-in-law, The townspeople come. The next morning, Christ gets up very early, goes out to pray. The townspeople, being led apparently by Simon or Peter, come to find him. And that he says, look, I'm not your personal pet. I didn't come here for that. I came here to proclaim what?
Good news.
The good news. Okay. And so, and it's not just for you. The good news isn't just for Capernaum. The good news is for everybody. So I got to leave and go to these other towns. So he resists being kept as Capernaum's special, magic man, magic pet. All right. Now, in the gospel accounts, it gives us the place and the content and the authentication for this second preaching tour. Now, remember, this is the second tour. Earlier, he was on the same tour, right? And he goes up to Nazareth, and then he comes back to Capernaum and establishes his hometown there. Now, this is the second time that he's going throughout that same region on a second preaching tour, all right? Now, the gospel accounts say that his preaching was done primarily in the synagogue. So while many times we think, he's out on some mountain someplace, or he's on, I don't know, like at a corner of a street preaching, the biblical accounts most of the time have him preaching in the synagogues. Okay, because remember, the synagogues were a place where many of the devout Jews would come 3 times a day. Right? They would come every single day. Right? So this was a place where people would congregate in these synagogues. So it was a great place for Jesus to continue to preach. Whoever came, he was going to be able to preach about the good news. Now, the content, we go back here. It says here in Luke's account, I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God, right? Now, we think the good news or gospel, that's what good news means, the gospel. I need to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom of God. I want to again reiterate, because we've talked about this before. When he's talking about gospel here, he is not talking about his death and resurrection. That is not what he's proclaiming as the gospel. Because his death and resurrection hasn't happened yet. You can't be proclaiming the fact that, hey, I died for your sins and I was raised from the dead. Hasn't happened yet. It specifically says not about preaching the good news of salvation from sin or things like that. I'm preaching the gospel, the good news of what? The kingdom of God. And we've talked about the fact that the kingdom of God is the messianic kingdom. That's what the Old Testament looked forward to. That was the high point of Old Testament prophecy, was the Messiah coming and establishing the messianic kingdom. So when he's talking about that, he's offering as the good news, look, I'm the Messiah. I'm the promised one from the Old Testament that is talked about, right? And here's the things that I'm doing. Let me show you. And he does all these things to validate it. If you accept me as the Messiah, then I will establish the messianic kingdom in your day. That's what he's proclaiming. The Messiah is here, right? Yes, would he still have died? I don't know why I'm using this mic, because I got one. Yeah. Yes, he would have still had to die on the cross. Now, we talked about this earlier. Now, again, this is one of those ideas, one of those counterfactuals. We don't know what the counterfactual is because we don't know what the factual is. But he would have had to die. Most likely, though, what would have happened, and we get hints of this from the gospel. Remember at the very end, right before he's crucified and arrested, right? Caiaphas stands up and says that it's expedient for one man to die for what? The sake of the people, the nation. The idea behind that is that if Christ is proclaimed as the King of Israel, as this Messianic king, guess what Rome is going to do? What's Rome going to do? Yeah, Rome does. There is no king other than the emperor. So if Christ presents himself out there, they would have accepted him. Then he would have then had to die somehow, very likely through the Romans. He would have still risen from the dead and established the Messianic kingdom. So his death still would have occurred, very likely would have occurred, again, at the hands of the Romans, which occurred that way in real life, just for different reasons, right? It would have been for political reasons and not for these trumped up charges that were religious, or primarily religious, right? So what he's offering there then in this preaching tour is, I'm the Messiah. And in fact, the demons just said that he is the what? The Christ. They recognize that Christ has come. So this preaching tour is about the Messianic kingdom is here. I'm the Messiah. and I'm doing all these things to authenticate who I am. That's what the content of the gospel is. Now, the content of the gospel will change once he's rejected as the Messiah by the nation, and once he has died and risen from the dead. Then the gospel actually does change at that point to being the good news about the death of Christ for the forgiveness of sins, right? And again, his authentication for his message are these healings and the casting out of demons. So he continues to demonstrate his authority over disease and over the supernatural world through his authority over the demonic realm. All right. Now, as he's on this preaching tour, then you can imagine what's going to happen. Like, his fame is going to spread, and it's exactly what it did. It spread, and it says throughout all Syria, and then we've got the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the Jordan, right? So what's interesting about this is because of his preaching tour, he's primarily focused on the Jewish people, but the areas that are mentioned here are not all Jewish, right? You've got Syria, which would be heavily Gentile populated. The Decapolis was heavily populated by Gentiles, very small Jewish populations there. Jerusalem and Judea and beyond the Jordan, those would have been Jewish areas. So what we see here is that because of what he's doing, his fame spreads not just to Jewish people, but also to Gentile people. And it spreads outside of what we would consider the land of Israel proper, at least in this case. So we've got Galilee, which we know is the northern part, north of the Jerusalem area in Judea. We've got the Decapolis, which is going to be to the east, and that's literally Decapolis, the 10 cities. And let me actually show you here. I got a picture. I don't know if you can see this here, but the area kind of up there in blue, that's all of Syria. So that would extend even further up than what we have there. So right now, he is, and I know this is really bad radio because the people online can't see it, but in the middle of this, right there where the green and the red meet, this is the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is right there at the top just a little bit to the left. That's where Capernaum is. He's going around the sea, this area of Galilee there. And that's where Tiberias, he's going around that area, but then you can see all the other areas that it spreads to: Syria up north, to the coast on the west of the Galilee area, to the east, which was the Decapolis. He had these 10 cities that were on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and then, of course, all the way down to the area that was to the west of the Jordan River. All right? So any questions about what has happened?
When he was on this route, the disciples were with him, right?
Yes.
He wasn't trekking by himself.
Well, I say yes. We don't know because the biblical account doesn't tell us.
Yeah.
And the next thing we're going to talk about would seem to imply heavily that, in fact, the disciples were sort of part-time following him, but not full-time at this point. So were there some disciples with him? Likely. Were they all 5 of them with him? Because there's only 5 disciples at this time, only 5 core disciples, only 5 of them at this time. Were all 5 of them following him? Likely not, because the next situation tells us, that they're in fact out fishing, right? You got 4 out of the 5, or actually 4 out of the 6 at this point are out there fishing as their full-time business.
Imagine having an encounter with Christ. He had to, on those times when he was by himself, he had to encounter people, right?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean,
Imagine-
he's going to
imagine
preaching.
that.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that, man?
In Matthew, where you were just reading from, it says that the news had spread about him as far as Syria. And so people had been bringing all their sick and disease to him. And whatever their sickness or disease was, he healed them all.
And that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. When the Messiah is present, if you're going to be the Messiah, you're going to have to be able to heal everything. So it doesn't work to kind of be the hit and miss. So when the Messiah is present, That is a different environment than when the Messiah is absent. I wish it wasn't different, but it is, because the purpose of doing what he's doing there is the authentication of who he is as his person,
We were, a show called The Chosen,
which I'm going to talk about in a minute.
and there was a couple of things that happened. Peter's wife lost a child. And, you know, whether it was true or not, I don't know, but the question is why didn't he heal her? And then there was little James, the apostle James, not the brother, little James. He had an infirmity, or whatever. He had a peg leg. And Jesus specifically says, I'm not going to heal you. It's going to be miraculous what you're going to be able to do to so many people, even though you're still not well. I mean, so, you know, whether or not that's, it's a true story or not, the point is that that's the point. He's not going to heal everybody, but in this case, he healed them all that were brought to him.
Yeah, and one of the things now, I'm going to say this right now. I love The Chosen. It's caused me to weep many times. And I encourage everyone to read it, but it's not the Bible. And of course, the two things you just mentioned there aren't biblical.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
But
what it's not impossible. What I'm saying is that he chose not to do something.
well, but
Just
we
like
actually don't have any account. We don't have that account though in the Bible. So they're trying to create a situation. That's not the biblical account, right? Okay. So when Christ encounters someone that needs healing, what happens? He heals them. So I guess what I would say is, as much as I love that series, and I actually do love it, I think it's really good TV, and it has helped to really humanize some of the stuff for me. It's not the Bible. And so I wouldn't want to draw any theological conclusions off of that as an entertainment, a form of entertainment. In fact, what we're going to talk about right now, if you just watch the episode of The Chosen where this occurs, they get it wrong on several accounts, which is fine. I'm fine, because it's just a piece of entertainment. But that's why even Dallas Jenkins says, read your Bibles. Like, I'm not the Bible. My show's not the Bible. I'm here just to create entertainment that hopefully brings some glory to God, but it's not the Bible. So so all I would say is that situation, that's not what you find in the Bible though. So I'm not going to base my theology off of sometimes Christ does or doesn't heal. Yeah. All right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
I would say, even though it's not biblically accurate or theologically accurate, because if Christ is there, he would get healed. I think in a situation where Christ is not present, where you would have someone who's not getting healed and they still have faith, or if someone gets healed and they have faith, I would say that in both cases, God still has power and authority and victory over the infirmity, even if he doesn't choose to heal it, because there's faith despite it.
Yeah, and again, this healing's always tough because it's personal, right? Like, you can talk about a lot of things that are theoretical that don't impact you, but all of us have been sick, and all of us probably have dealt with someone who has died or suffered extreme agony with certain types of ailments, and so it's very personal, and so we have a hard time with why God does or doesn't do that. But yeah, I mean, he always has. In fact, Hebrews chapter 1, right? It says what? Christ sustains what? The universe by the word of his what? Power. Everything exists and continues to exist by that. So in other words, the fact that he doesn't heal you or me says nothing about his power. It says something about his will. For whatever reason, and we won't know probably in this life, for whatever reason, he's like, no, I'm not going to do this for whatever the reason is. And we don't know. And to rack our brains, here's one of the things. One of my main areas of focus is when I went to get my master's was the idea of why God allows evil. And I came out of that, and here's the thing. We always ask the wrong question. The wrong question we ask is this: why, God, did you allow this to happen? And that's a foolish question, because rarely are you going to get the answer. You're asking a question, you're not going to get rarely are you're going to actually know the reason for why that happened. So you can spend your whole entire life asking the question, even getting bitter about the issue, or you can ask, what, God, do you want me to do in the midst of the thing that you have allowed? I'm going to pray. I know you can heal if it's within your will, but how do you want me to respond? That's the right question. How and what, not why. Okay, because why is a dead end in this life? Yeah. Anyway, all right. So great. Let's get to our last little section here that I wanted to cover for tonight. So he's now on this second preaching tour, right? And this next event then happens as he's kind of coming around. He's still in the Galilee region, and he's going to be coming around the lake, the Sea of Galilee. And this is where this next situation happens, where he shows that he has authority over nature. So we've seen the fact that he has authority over teaching, he has authority over scripture, he has authority over demons, he has authority over sickness and over health. Now he's going to show that he has authority over nature. What else is left on the bucket list for him to check off? You already have authority over the supernatural realm. Demons can't stand in your presence. You have authority over the supernatural. You have authority over sickness and health and whatever else. And you have authority over the natural world. All right. Not a lot to check off, right? So we're going to get sort of that third leg of the stool right here with this next particular authority passage that we have. Now I'm going to go ahead and just read Luke, and then I'm going to just point out a few things that we have different within Mark. So he's on his preaching tour, and it says, on one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, or this is called the Sea of Galilee. Now, and then I'll just read through it, and then I'll make an observation. Otherwise, I'll just end up teaching right here in the slides I created. It won't be any good, so it'll just be nonsense. All right. And he saw two boats by the lake. So the crowds are pressing in on him. He sees two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets. And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Right? So there's a miracle here, right? Now, Mark says that he's passed along the Sea of Galilee. So the Lake of Gennesaret and Sea of Galilee are the same thing. And he adds, and immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. So we have here the fact that the fishing business is owned by Zebedee. And Zebedee's two sons, John and James, are there. And Simon and Andrew are partners in this fishing business. So you have these two families that are partners in this fishing business on the Sea of Galilee. So 4 of his disciples are fishermen, and they've all been working together for probably quite a while. They're probably good friends, right? Peter, James, John, and Andrew. All right. Now, what we see here is we see the addition of the 6th disciple that we have, because it mentions James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. Now, we already mentioned that when Christ came back out of the wilderness and he came back to the Jordan area, And and John the Baptist pointed out who Christ was, that one of the people that ends up following Christ at the time is John the Apostle, right? Now we have his brother James that gets pulled into this group, right? So what we have here is, with this particular event, we now have 6 disciples. We've got Peter, Andrew, John, Philip, and Nathaniel, who were the 5 during the first week of his ministry. And now we have now we have James that has been added to this group of 6. So now we have half of the group of disciples that have been gathered in at this point, right? Now, the other thing that we see here is it says that he says, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on a little farther, he saw James, blah, blah, blah. And immediately he called to them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. Now, this seems a little bit strange to most people, because you look at it and say, wait, I thought Peter and Andrew and John were already like disciples. To your point, Rich, they were disciples of him, but a disciple would come to their master to learn, and then they would go back home and they would do whatever they needed to. So before this event, we've got Peter and Andrew and John are part-time disciples. They're coming to Christ, they're learning, they're going on a few adventures with him here and there, that type of stuff, but they still have a business to run. They got jobs. And in fact, it's a family business. They're just not a hired hand. This is their business, right? Zebedee owns at least part of it, and Peter and Andrew are partners with James and John in this family business. So that's why they're not full-time disciples yet. But after this time, Rich, to your point, now he says, drop your nets. You're no longer going to be fishers of fish. You're going to be fishers of men. They have now been called in to full-time discipleship at this point, going forward. Okay? All right.
So originally, how many disciples were with Jesus? You know?
Oh, at which time?
Well, I mean, in total.
Well,
Well,
there
I
were
mean,
12.
but there were more, right?
Well, there
At
were
one point-
12 within his close. He had 12 within his close-knit group.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And those would have been likely because it mimics the 12 tribes. But then you
Yeah.
had the 70 he sends out. Of
Yeah.
course, that's the 12 plus,
Yeah.
68 more.
Now, didn't some of those drop off? Some of
Well, no,
the
but
70?
then you've got the other people that were disciple. Disciple just means follower or learner of.
Right,
That he also had the crowds that were also disciples from there. So when we talk about disciples, you've got the inner group of 12, and even within the inner group of 12, you've got the inner group of 3. You got
so, yeah, so what I find interesting about that is relationally how, in the church, just say the beginning of the church with the calling of the 12, there seem to be different positions relationally to Christ. It doesn't seem like I would necessarily have the same relationship or position to Christ as, say, Peter would.
Well, no, and it's clear that the inner 3, Peter, James, and John, were part of his inner group of the
Yeah, so
12.
how do I get in on that group?
Well, you can't. It's 2,000 years ago, but
But I mean, he says God is not a respecter of persons. But
well, not from a salvation perspective, but certainly from a gifting. The Bible says that we're not all gifted. Each one of us as believers has at least one gift. Some of us have more than one gift, but none of us have all the gifts. And you have different gifts than I do. So that doesn't mean he's not a respecter of persons, that in fact, we're all equal in the role that he's called us to our gifting. In fact, the Bible is completely opposite. We are a body. I might be the big toe and you might be the eye. They have different functions. So we can't look at this at the equality. Equality happens what? Salvation wise, right? We're all equal under the cross from salvation, but the roles he has for us in the giftings are all different, right? And I can't complain that my gifting is not your gifting, right? Even though I would like to.
did I sound like I was complaining?
No. I'm just trying to say
I
that
just think it's interesting that there are these different relational positions
Mhm.
with Christ. in the church. You know, and I remember, Jim Wright teaching a while ago, long time ago, I think it was Hebrews. And about how, well, I can't remember the verse, but it was like imagining myself in heaven. You know, I'm in the back of the room, you know, looking across this expanse of people and the people that are in Christ's, inner circle, so to speak.
Well,
And I don't, that's really more of a rhetorical thing.
Yeah.
Randall, and you don't really have to expound on it,
well,
but I just find it interesting that in these accounts, that, Jesus called the 12 out, right? He went looking for them and called them out.
Yeah.
And when he encountered them, I mean, in the chosen, what's interesting about that, when he encountered them, they had no choice. It was like it was like a moment in time, almost like a destiny, for them to encounter Christ and then answer the call.
yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say that, yes, your observation is correct, that we have different roles and different functions, and even within Christ's group, he had obviously different relationships with different people within his own inner group. Whether or not, how far that extends into the future, it certainly extends into the Messianic kingdom, because we know about that, but whether it extends into the eternal order, that's the question. So when you talk about the sea of people, you're talking about the eternal order. That's not the Messianic kingdom, right? So those are two different things. So I'd be careful about imagining myself in heaven, way in the back of the room, stuck in the corner with a dunce cap on, and just like seeing Christ as a little speck because he doesn't want to be close to me. So anyway.
That's how I feel, sorry.
No, but just the imagery sort of paints a lesser than distance. And in the eternal order, that's not what's pictured. But in the Messianic kingdom, there is pictured that. The 12, and this is going into eschatology. I have to, we'll all right. Okay, so he's preaching beside the Sea of Galilee. Now, I have this quote here from John Rousseau. It says, the lake was known as the Sea of Chinnereth or Chinneroth, also Gennesaret. It was the Sea of Tiberias, and often in rabbinic literature, it was called the Sea of Tiberias in rabbinic literature. The term Sea of Galilee is only found in the New Testament. So this is kind of a unique term for that, because it's not found in any other Jewish or rabbinic literature. Now, this sea, if you go over it, the dimensions probably were a little different in the time of Christ, but it's actually big. It's a big lake. You go there, I mean, it's not tiny. It's about 8 miles wide, 13 miles long. So it's a pretty decent little jot up and down if you got yourself into a boat. This was the center of the Jewish fishing industry, right? In fact, they had a town that was there that was the salt town. It's where they would take all the fish and they would salt them. So the fishermen would come and bring in their catch. They'd be salted, and of course, it would be distributed throughout the nation and externally based off of that. We do have records, Jewish records, that describe that the fishing industry there was monopolized by families. Like you had like major families that would have ownership of stuff. They had like fleets, so to speak. And it appears what we have here then is Zebedee is likely the head owner of this, and his sons, John and James, are part of the business, as well as partners with Andrew and Peter. Who knows how many other people might have been part of that conglomerate of the fishing group, but this is what we see here. So these guys are part of the same business on the Sea of Galilee, right? Now, what we get here is what's going on is Christ is on his preaching tour, and he's back around the Sea of Galilee. And at some point, because of his preaching and his healing, remember, his preaching tour includes not just the spoken word, but it includes his healing of people and casting out demons. So now he's attracting so much attention that the crowds are literally pressing in on him as if they're like pushing him into the water. There's the picture is that he's got no place to go at this point because the crowds are just getting in super close. So what does he do? he sees two boats by the lake. Well, one of them is Simon's. The other one is going to be John and James's boat, right? There's two boats. And they're empty because Peter, Andrew, James, and John are cleaning and fixing their nets, right? That's what's going on. So he sees his boat. He climbs in and he says to Peter, hey, push out just a little bit, just so that I can get enough away from the shore where people aren't going to come and press in on me anymore. And then he sits down in the boat and he begins to continue preaching, right? That's the purpose of him getting into the boat, right? And then it says, and when he finished speaking, so he's done preaching now. Now, this is again, I love The Chosen, but if you remember this, The Chosen scene has it where this is Peter's first encounter with Christ, and he hasn't accepted Christ as the Messiah yet, and this is the incident that caused him to do it. Well, no, Peter's already been a disciple before this. Okay, so again, not correct. The other thing is that in the show, they show these fish jumping into the boat, and the boat is where? At the shore. No. Christ asked him to put out into the deep part of the lake. So now he's gone way out into the deep part of the lake. He's not at the shore anymore. He's out there in the middle of the lake. Now put down your nets, right? So again, if you just kind of look at some stuff, it's all good theater, but it's not the Bible, right? So put down into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. Now, what Simon says, he says, Master, we've toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word, I will let down the nets. Okay, so here's what's going on, right? The Jewish people had these nets called trammel nets, and the way that they were designed is they have three layers to them. The inner layer is going to have bigger holes in it, right? So as you drop the nets down and then you bring them up, the fish are going to go through these big holes. But then the next layer, the holes are smaller, and then the under layer is going to be, the holes are going to be really tiny so that they can't get out. So what happens, you get these fish that swim through the bigger holes, and they get trapped either between that first layer and second layer, or if they're small enough to go through the second layer, they get trapped between the second and third layer, right? And then you pull up the nets, and now all the fish have gotten trapped because of these stacked nets that are called these trammel nets, right? Okay. And what would happen here is that you would fish at night, right? So part of what they got right there was Peter's out there in the boat, right, fishing at night. Now they claim he's doing it because he wants to get away from the Romans, but no, you fished at night. The reason why you fished at night is because these trammel nets are visible to the fish. They won't come around. I mean, it's like you might as well dangle your feet in the water and kick around, and the fish are going to go away. So they fish at night so that the fish don't see the nets. The other thing is that on the Sea of Galilee, when the sun is hot there, when the sun comes out, it gets too hot, so the fish all go down too deep. So your nets are useless because the fish have all gone deep into the water. So you fish at night there, right? And you can still see that to this day. They go out and fish at night and they come in the morning. So what we have here is we have Peter saying, and remember, when Christ comes to the boat, Peter, Andrew, James, and John are at the side, they're out of their boats and they're fixing their nets, because that's what you do. You go fishing at night, you bring in the haul, you turn them over to the salters and everyone else, and then you go and you fix your net, and then you're done for the day. And then you come back out later on that night. So what Peter is saying here is he's saying, when Christ says, go out to the deep and put down your net, Peter's like, okay, sun's up. Like, you might be the carpenter, you might know about building stuff, but guess what? I'm the fisherman. And you don't fish during the daytime. And by the way, Christ, we've been out all night, and guess what we got? Zero. We didn't get a fish the whole night. So you're saying that we were out all night, and by the way, we've been on this lake probably most of our entire life. As soon as we were big enough to be in a boat, we've been out here. We know how to fish. We know where the good spots are at. And we got nothing. And you're telling me to go out when we shouldn't be doing it in the middle of the day, and we're going to catch something, put down the nets. So you see this idea here with Peter, right? And what we see then is that Peter is saying, okay, great. But what does he do? He recognizes what about Christ? Even though Christ is telling him to do something that's completely illogical. No fisherman is going to recommend doing that. What does Christ recognize, though, about Christ?
Peter?
Well, Peter, sorry. What does Peter recognize about Christ? Sorry. He's the Messiah. Yeah, I mean, he hasn't demonstrated that yet, but he recognizes that he's had. He's healed a whole bunch of people, and he's cast a bunch of demons. So Peter says, look, even though you're asking me to do the dumbest thing in the world, I'll do it. I'll do what you say. Okay.
I like how they showed that in the Chosen where.
Yeah.
Peter goes.
Yeah.
Christ goes.
Yeah. That's what's going there. So he lowers it down, and of course, they pull at the net, and it's so much that the nets are about ready to break, and they call to the other boat. Now, the other boat is James and John's boat. All right. So they bring that boat over, and the boats get filled up so much that they begin to sink. Right. So that's the miracle. Now, some commentators recognize that there's more than one miracle here. There's two miracles. Right. And I don't know if there's two or not, but the likelihood that they're going to go out and as experienced fishermen who know exactly where to go for the fish, the likelihood that they're not going to catch any fish is probably not very high. So some have actually suggested that the first miracle was that God shut up the fish and didn't allow them to be caught. So that the second miracle of catching fish is not that they caught some fish, but just not a lot. They didn't catch any. So there perhaps was a first miracle of that, but certainly the second miracle is what we see here with these fish. Now, we don't know, because the text doesn't say, whether these fish were caught ex nihilo or created ex nihilo, or whether they were actually in the lake and God just sort of, I don't know, moved them in some way into the nets. Did God create them out of nothing, or did God just shoo them in there? We don't know. But whatever it is, we see that, of course, he has power over nature. That's right. So we don't know. And it's interesting. Now we see here what happens with Peter. He says, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord." Like, that's the response. If we're going to pull anything out from tonight, that's the response that we should have. We recognize who Christ is. We recognize his power. We recognize who he is in our life. We recognize him as Lord of not only our life, but Lord of the universe. That's our response. Just like that. Like, what is it, the Wayne's World, and that old movie, like, we're not worthy, right? I can just, we're not worthy. It's exactly what he is saying right here. Depart from me, I'm a sinful man, O Lord. Now, it does say that they catch all these fish, and it says that the crowds were astonished, right? Now, the word that they have here for astonished, and it includes James and John, astonished, is this idea of being like completely, like, your mind is so blown, you can't believe your eyes. Like, it's impossible. You think you've seen something, but it's so amazing that you can't really trust your senses. Or to be frozen with fear, to be horrified, or to stare. So very likely these people couldn't believe it, and they actually might have been fearful. Like, what are we seeing here now? Go on. We've seen people heal before, and the stuff Christ has done is amazing, but we've never seen this happen before. Like, if he can do this over healing, if he can do this over demons, and then he can control nature, like, there is an amazement here and an astonishment that comes with that. And of course, Christ then says to them, he said to Simon, "Do not be afraid." Right? Isn't that what Christ says repeatedly over and over again? When they're fearful, what does he say?
It's the number one message in the Bible.
Don't be afraid. Right?
You're not fearful.
So what we can take from here, this here, is that Christ says, look, things may be out of control. You may be fearful, which the crowd was fearful. And in fact, that's the reason why this word astonished here, I don't think just means like, oh gosh, man, and like you're watching a magician, like, that's really cool. Like, there's legit fear. Like, who is this person that's doing this? And he says, do not be afraid, right? And then of course, he says, from now on, you'll be catching men, which means, of course, they're to put away their fishing nets and to become full-time fishermen, what that means. Think about this for just a moment. This is your business. This is a family business. This is the only way you make money. And it was actually pretty good money. And now Jesus says, stop, quit your job and follow me. Well, where are we going to get the money from? You don't have a job, Jesus. Just follow me. Like, the real test here of faith, if we're talking about faith, comes in the response to the call of Christ. And they respond to his call and say, okay, it's fine. You got it. And they follow him. Right? That is the sort of the one thing that we want to pull out of that tonight. Yes, Mike.
Will you address the difference in the Gospels between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Whereas Matthew and Mark, because this is a big deal.
Mhm.
Matthew and Mark say that Jesus came and saw them repairing their nets in the boats. And in Luke, it says he saw two empty boats sitting there,
Mhm.
and he went out and performed this miracle, and it wasn't even addressed in the other two Gospels.
Yeah, I mean, if you come back, so you're talking, oops. So it says here, they were casting a net, okay, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers and they were casting nets into the sea, right? And he says, follow me. Now, you notice here, this is truncated because what Matthew has here is he leaves out everything. So his perspective is just at some point, Jesus walked on the Sea of Galilee and they're out there fishing. And then he tells them to follow me. Well, we know that this is a truncated version. There's no discrepancy here at this point. It's just Matthew's left out everything. He's left out all the details of
It's a
that,
big
right?
deal.
Well, it's not a big deal.
Well, it's a miracle. It's two miracles. But he left it out completely.
Yeah, but it did because it doesn't fit his purpose. I mean, they have to choose. If you go back to what I said in session 1 or session 2, and even John says in John chapter 20, if I were to if everything was to be recorded, what he said and did, the world couldn't contain it. So what that tells you is, okay, we got to be selective. So every gospel writer has to be selective. Just like if I asked each one of you tonight, as soon as we left, go home and just write a quick summary of who was in the room and what they did, or just a summary of the evening. Some of you might write about how many people were in the room, who was sitting where. And I might say, there was a guy up front and he was teaching, and I might talk about the topic, right? There's no contradiction here. There is a difference in perspective, right? There's no conflict there. Matthew truncates it because he leaves out everything and it's not important to him. The miracle wasn't important to him. I mean, if you can point out a contradiction, that's fine. There's no contradiction. There's just a difference in their perspective. Does that make sense?
It does in that regard, but what my point is that was a big deal. It was a huge miracle, and I'm just surprised that it wasn't mentioned. You know, and there's been other writings too, you know, when Peter walked on the water, that was left out of other gospels as well. It was only mentioned, I believe, in Mark.
Well, if each one of the gospels record exactly the same thing, you only need one you wouldn't need all 3 gospels, you need one. You got 3 different writers. For their purpose, they're recording whatever it is that's important for their theme, right? John doesn't record hardly anything that are in the synoptics, but he records a lot of stuff that the synoptics don't include. So we get a lot of information that aren't in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Does that mean there's a conflict? No, it just means that John wanted to record like the high priestly prayer. Well, we don't get that. You get that from John. So again, there's no conflict. It would be, again, if I asked each one of you to go write about this, I guarantee you, I would get how many people are in this room? I don't know how many people are in this room, 8 people. I get 8 different accounts of tonight, and they would all be correct. Just like you're watching an accident. Yeah.
I'm curious as to that would get left out. And, you know, only included in Luke, wasn't included in Mark, wasn't included in Matthew. And I'm just surprised that, just like I'm surprised that the walking on water, Peter walking on water was included in the Gospels either.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we look at these as being big events, but here's the thing. Just imagine this. What if one of the gospel writers said, Jesus went, which they did, Jesus went around all of the Galilee area and he did what? He healed many people of various diseases and demons. So that's one account. And then one of the gospel writers gave you the account of the 130 people that were healed in a town. I mean, why one person would summarize it and another person would give details, we don't know. I mean, you have to get in the mind of the author at that point to figure that out. And they don't. So I understand where you're saying, like, gosh, that seems like a big event. But for their purposes, they choose what they want to include in there.
Fair enough. But, you know, even Fruchtenbaum says, he talks about the 3 synoptic accounts.
Yeah.
Fruchtenberger. He talks about the three synoptic accounts of Matthew's theme was kingship.
Yep.
Mark was the Messiah's perfect servanthood, and we're
Yep.
talking about the healing of Simon's mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And Luke, his theme was the Messiah, the ideal man.
Yep.
So the point he's trying to make is that they all spoke to the same thing, that she was healed and the fever left her.
Yeah, I mean,
Nobody left any one of those specific things out. And he made a point of the fact that each one of the gospels spoke exactly the same thing.
yeah, but that's because they record, so here's the answer. We don't know why some recorded events and others did. It was whatever, for whatever their theme
I think it's
was.
strange, is all.
Oh,
All I'm trying to
okay.
say is I think it's strange that this is a big deal.
Well, I would agree that we might wonder why they didn't, but I don't know that this is any more bigger deal than casting out 100 demons or, all this other, I mean, we think it's a big deal because we've got the details of it here, but I don't have the detail. We don't have the details of most of the stuff he did, that if we had details, if one of the writers had written them and the others hadn't put it in there, we might think, gosh, those were all big deals. Why didn't he include them? So yes, I agree. It's interesting that they record different stuff for whatever their purposes are, why they do it, no big deal. But the one thing I wanted to address, because you did talk about a contradiction or conflict, that is where I was getting at. There's no contradiction here. So I just want to be clear that what was put out there, I'm addressing that, not the sort of curiosity as I wonder why one person didn't do this or another.
I'm not saying that here, it's just like you said, it's truncated here, truncated there, and filled in the blanks.
Yep. Okay, great, fantastic. Oh, one more question. Yeah.
So I'm a little bit fuzzy on the development of this miracle. So Jesus is preaching in Galilee, like all over in Galilee, right?
And at this point, he's now by the Sea of Galilee.
Okay, so does he have this crowd that's there that's just following him wherever he's going? And he just chose to go to the Sea of Galilee? Or was he at the Sea of Galilee and then the crowd showed up?
So the previous section that we covered, which was his authority to preach, talked about the fact that he went into all the Galilee area and also Judea, and that his fame had spread. So who these people are and where they've come from, likely some of them were from around Capernaum, but many of them probably have come from other parts of the land, even maybe outside the land. So we don't know how many people were following him. We don't know exactly how long they've been following him or any of that. The text doesn't describe it. What it does describe, though, is that they were pressing in on him so much that he had to actually get into a boat to get away. So, yeah, his fame has spread so much that he can't walk without being mauled at this point.
Okay.
And that will actually happen to him again.
So now he's preaching from the boat, the crowd is on the shore, and from that point, he sends the fishermen out?
No.
Or-
So he gets into the boat and he says, Simon, push a little away from the shore.
Right.
So Simon is at least in the boat, perhaps Andrew or whatever else, but at least Simon's in the boat because he told Simon, push us out. So now imagine there's the shoreline and the boat is probably 3, 4, 5 feet. It's far enough out there where no one's going to want to get into the water and stand to listen to him.
Right.
So they're going to stay on the shore. So that's all he wants is
What I mean when I say like send them out, I mean like go out to go catch fish. Like are these at the same time or are they separated?
No. So he gets it.
Because-
So he's in the boat. He's just a little bit off of the shore. He's preaching. And then it says when he stopped speaking, so he's done preaching because that's what he's using it for. Then he says to Simon, who's in the boat with him, because Simon's the one that moved the boat out and it's Simon's boat. Simon, go out to the deep and let down your nets. So Simon takes the boat out into the deep part, puts down his nets, and they pull up this fish. And of course, I don't know how the communication happens or whatever else, but obviously there's a signal to James and John, get your boat, and they hightail it out there. And then that's when they drop their nets, and their nets are so filled to the point of breaking, and they're both the boats are to the point of sinking. Right.
So Jesus is preaching, the crowd is on the shore, he stops preaching, and then he sends them out to go catch fish.
But he's still in the boat with them.
Oh, he goes with them.
Yeah,
Okay,
he's in the boat when he's preaching, then he tells Simon, go out further. So he's still there because remember, when they pull in this hall, Simon does what? He falls at his what? His knees.
uh-huh,
And the reason why he falls at his knees is because Christ is sitting.
right,
So in the boat, Simon falls at his knees there, which again is not what you would get portrayed on the Chosen. But again, I won't be nitpicky. But anyway, they're out there with his being pulled in, and that's when he falls to his knees at that
Alright.
point. Yeah.
and the crowd just hasn't left the shore until they get
Well, they
back.
see what's going on. They can tell. I mean, again, they're not far enough out there where they're like little specks in the horizon. They can see what's going on. So they're close enough where they can see them struggling and pulling this up, and the fish, and the boat's getting lower, and the call for John and James. And so the crowd's now watching all this go on because you're not supposed to be able to catch fish during that time of the day. So they're watching. So yeah, that's all happening, but they're now away from the shore when the fish are caught.
Okay.
All right, any other questions? Anyone online? All right, well, I'll go ahead and close in prayer, and then we'll see you next week. How's that? God, again, we're just thankful for everyone that is here, either in person or online. God, we just thank you so much for the time that many of us have had this summer to go ahead and take vacation, to relax, get refreshed, and to think more about you. God, we just thank you for those opportunities. God, I just thank you for bringing us back together. I thank you for the safety that you've given each one of us. And God, I just pray right now that you would help to speak to our hearts, God, that you would increase our faith, that our reaction would be as Peter's was when he bowed before you and said, I'm not worthy, and he recognized who you were. That God, we would put our faith and our trust completely and totally in you, even when our lives are turned upside down or they don't make sense. God, we just pray that you'd be with each one of us, bring us back safely next week. We ask that in Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
To say that